The alarm cut through the training hall like a blade, and every student in the room dropped to the floor except her. I remember that moment better than I remember my own name day. 60 of us, from 12 different systems, sprawled across the cold plating with our hands over our ears, and Nora Ellison stood there, calm as a still lake, watching the red lights spin on the ceiling. The alarm was fake, a drill. The instructors did this every few weeks to test our nerves, and every few weeks we failed it the same way, flinching, crying out, forgetting our training the moment the noise hit our bones. It was supposed to be humbling. It was supposed to remind us that humans, the newest and weakest species allowed into the Varan Academy, were not the only fragile ones in this galaxy. Except Nora never flinched. I was the one who noticed first, because I was assigned to the desk beside hers, and I had spent 3 weeks being quietly fascinated by how little she reacted to anything. When the counselor asked her why she did not drop with the rest of us, she just shrugged and said something that made no sense to me at the time. "That's just thunder," she said. "We get worse than that at home." I laughed, because I thought she was joking. Nobody in the hall laughed with me. They were too busy staring at her, some with pity, some with the particular curled lip that the Draith students reserved for anyone they considered beneath them. Her name did not mean much to anyone before that day. Nora Ellison, human, 17 years old by her planet's count, the second person from Earth ever accepted into the Academy's exchange program. The first one had left after 4 months, unable to keep up with the coursework, and everyone assumed Nora would do the same. She was small compared to the rest of us, no natural armor, no venom glands, no wings, nothing but soft skin and 2 arms, and a face that showed every emotion far too easily. I am Callan Ward, and back then I was nothing special either, just a second-year student from a mid-ranked family, trying to survive my own classes without embarrassing myself. I did not choose to notice her. She simply kept appearing at the edges of my attention, like a puzzle piece that did not match the picture on the box. The first week, she barely spoke. She sat at the back of every lecture, took notes by hand on a small device that looked ancient compared to our neural slates, and ate alone in the far corner of the dining hall where the light was worst and the noise was least. When students spoke to her, she answered politely, briefly, and then went quiet again. It was easy to mistake her silence for weakness. Almost everyone did. Ivo Sten certainly did. Ivo came from a Draith noble line, the kind of family that had statues in 3 different star systems, and he treated the academy like a formality he was required to attend before his real life began. He had scales the color of a sunset, and a voice that could fill a hall without trying, and from the very first day, he decided that humans were beneath his notice, except when he wanted an easy target for his jokes. He called her the paper girl, because she seemed like she might tear if you looked at her the wrong way. He would toss comments across the classroom about how humans were the galaxy's newest pets, adopted out of pity by species who felt guilty about how weak Earth truly was. Most of the time, Nora said nothing back. She would just look at him, steady and unreadable, and then return to her notes. I thought she was afraid of him. I was wrong about a lot of things that first month. The Academy itself sat on a ring station orbiting a quiet blue star, built centuries ago as neutral ground where the galaxy's rising species could be trained together before they were released into interstellar society. Every hallway curved gently to match the station's rotation, and every window looked out onto a view that should have made anyone feel small, in a good way. Endless stars, distant nebulae, the slow turn of a system too vast to fully understand. For most of us, that view was inspiring. For Nora, I noticed she rarely looked at it at all. She kept her eyes on doors, on exits, on the places where danger might enter a room. I did not understand this habit yet. I only knew it was different, and different, on a station full of proud and confident species, was dangerous in its own way. The turning point, the first real crack in the story everyone believed about her, happened during a mandatory environmental science lesson, the kind of class most of us treated as a break between harder subjects. The instructor, a broad-shouldered Corvi woman named Professor Hale, was demonstrating atmospheric toxicity using a sealed chamber and a small rodent-like creature bred specifically for these tests. She released a thin gas into the chamber, explaining how most oxygen-breathing species would experience mild disorientation within seconds, and how our own translators would alert us if the air around us ever reached a similar composition. Halfway through her explanation, the ventilation system in our actual classroom hiccuped. It was a small malfunction, the kind engineers fixed within minutes, but for a moment, a very thin thread of an unfamiliar chemical drifted from a nearby lab into our room through a shared vent. Nobody else noticed it right away. I certainly did not. Ivo was mid-sentence, mocking some other student's answer, and half the class was half asleep in the recycled afternoon air. Nora sat up straight before the professor's own sensors even chimed a warning. She said one word, sharp and clear. Out. Professor Hale turned, confused, and Nora was already moving, pulling the two students nearest the vent up from their seats and pushing them toward the door. Her voice did not rise, did not panic, but there was a force behind it that made people obey without arguing. By the time the room's alarms caught up to what she already seemed to know, we were all in the hallway, and the vent had been sealed by station maintenance drones responding to the same alert. Afterward, Professor Hale asked her, gently, curiously, how she had known. Nora looked almost embarrassed by the attention. "I just smelled it," she said. "It's sharper than most air should be. Back home, you learn to notice that fast, because it usually means something dangerous is happening nearby. Storms, fires, gas pockets in the ground. If you wait for someone to tell you, you're already too late." The room went quiet in a different way after that. Not mocking, not dismissive, just uncertain. Ivo, to his credit, or perhaps his embarrassment, did not have a joke ready that time. I started paying closer attention after that day, not because I suspected anything grand, but because I was curious, in the way you are curious, about a locked door in a house you thought you already knew completely. I began noticing small things. The way she never sat with her back to a doorway. The way her eyes moved constantly during meals, tracking movement around her without ever seeming to focus on any one thing too long. The faint, pale lines on her forearms that she never explained, and that I never had the courage to ask about directly. I also noticed how careful she was, almost deliberately so, never to draw attention to herself. When our combat theory instructor asked for volunteers to demonstrate a basic defensive stance, she was one of the last to raise her hand, and even then, her movements were slow, textbook perfect but oddly restrained, like someone playing a song one note at a time instead of the way it was meant to be played. It did not occur to me then that restraint might be the entire point. There was a girl named Petra Lang in our study group, from a species that communicated half through speech and half through subtle shifts in the color of her skin, and she was the one who first said out loud what I had only been thinking quietly. "She's holding back," Petra said one evening, watching Nora across the study hall as she solved a navigation problem the rest of us were still struggling to understand. "Look at her hands. She solves it, then she waits, like she's deciding how much of the answer to actually give us." I told Petra she was imagining things, that Nora was simply shy, but even as I said it, I did not fully believe myself. There was something in the way Nora carried herself, something coiled and careful, like a held breath that never quite let go. The truth is, in that first month, none of us knew anything real about where she came from. Her file, when any of us bothered to check the Public Academy directory, listed her homeworld only as Earth, a small blue and green planet on the very edge of known space, recently contacted, recently allowed limited access to interstellar institutions. There was no further detail, no description of her world's conditions, no explanation of its history, nothing that would tell us why a girl barely out of childhood moved through danger like she had spent her whole life rehearsing for it. We assumed, because it was easy to assume, that Earth must be an unremarkable place. A garden world, perhaps, quiet and safe, and that Nora's odd instincts were simply personal quirks, nothing more. I think back now on how wrong that assumption was, and how long it took for even a hint of the truth to surface. It began, fittingly, with weather. The Academy ran occasional simulations in its recreational dome, artificial environments meant to give students from vastly different worlds a small taste of conditions they would never otherwise experience. That week, the dome was set to simulate a mild electrical storm, mostly for atmospheric effect, soft rain, distant flashes of light, a low rumble meant to be pleasant rather than frightening. Most students found it charming, a novelty. Ivo complained loudly that the noise was giving him a headache. Petra's skin flickered nervously at each flash of simulated lightning. I stood near the edge of the dome, mildly impressed by the technology, mildly bored by the whole exercise. Nora stood perfectly still in the center of the open field, face turned upward, eyes closed, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked completely, entirely at ease. When the thunder rolled, low and artificial, she smiled. I asked her afterward why she looked so happy during something the rest of us found unsettling. She was quiet for a moment, the way she often was before she decided how much truth to share. "It reminds me of home," she said finally. "Real storms are much bigger than this, much louder. This is just a memory of one." I asked, carefully, what a real storm on her world was like. She looked at me, and for just a second, something passed behind her eyes that I did not yet have the experience to recognize. It was not fear. It was something closer to respect, the kind of expression a soldier might wear when remembering a battlefield rather than a bedtime story. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said, and then she walked back toward the dormitories, leaving me standing in the fading artificial rain with far more questions than I had arrived with. I did not know it then, but that conversation was the first thread in a much larger story, one that would eventually force every student and instructor on that station to completely rewrite what they believed about the fragile, quiet, paper-thin girl from a small blue planet nobody had bothered to study closely. We thought she was simply a student, doing her best to keep up in a world far more advanced than her own. We had no idea we were the ones who were unprepared. The rumors started small, the way rumors always do on a station full of bored, brilliant, competitive teenagers with nothing to prove and everything to prove at the same time. Someone said Nora had cheated on the toxicology test, because there was no way a human, a species barely a century into interstellar contact, could identify 17 different airborne compounds by scent alone. Someone else said she must have hidden sensors woven into her uniform, feeding her information the rest of us did not have access to. A few of the younger students, half joking, half serious, suggested she was some kind of secret weapon smuggled into the academy under the cover of an exchange program. I did not believe any of it, not fully, but I understood why the rumors spread so easily. It is a strange thing, watching someone quietly outperform every expectation set for them, and needing an explanation that does not require you to admit your assumptions were wrong from the start. Professor Hale, to her credit, shut down the cheating accusation within a day, publishing the toxicology results alongside a brief note explaining that Nora's performance, while unusual, fell within documented human sensory capabilities. The note did not explain why those capabilities existed in the first place. It simply stated that they did, the way a textbook states a fact without offering the story behind it. That should have been the end of it. It was not. A week later, during a mandatory physical assessment, something happened that made even Professor Hale pause. The assessment was simple in design, meant to measure baseline endurance across different gravity settings, since students from dozens of worlds needed to function comfortably in whatever conditions they might eventually be assigned to. The gravity in the testing chamber began at standard, comfortable for most humanoid species, then increased slowly over the course of the session. Most of us struggled as the gravity climbed. Petra's species, built for lighter worlds, tapped out early, her skin flashing an apologetic pale color as she stepped aside. Ivo, despite his size and obvious strength, began breathing heavily by the middle setting, sweat beading along his scales. Nora kept going. At first, nobody thought much of it. Endurance varied by species, and humans were not expected to be particularly strong in any single category. But, as the gravity climbed higher, past what should have been uncomfortable for a body her size. She did not slow down. She did not even seem to notice the increase in any meaningful way. Her breathing stayed even. Her movements stayed precise. By the time the assessment reached a setting that had already eliminated every other student in the room, Nora was the only one still standing, still moving through the required exercises with the same quiet focus she brought to everything else. Professor Hale ended the test early, not because Nora had failed, but because the equipment itself had reached a setting that exceeded normal testing protocols, a setting nobody had expected a human student to ever require. I still remember the look on Ivo's face as he watched her finish the final exercise, breathing steady, expression calm, while he stood off to the side with his hands on his knees, still recovering from a fraction of the gravity she had just endured without visible strain. He did not make a joke that day either. The whispers grew louder after that. Some students began avoiding her entirely, uncertain what to make of someone who broke so many quiet assumptions at once. Others, myself included, found ourselves drawn toward the mystery instead of away from it. I started asking around, carefully, quietly, trying to learn more about the planet she came from. The Academy's public records were unhelpful, filled with vague, generalized descriptions clearly written by administrators who had never set foot there themselves. Earth was described as a temperate world with varied ecosystems, a young interstellar member species, still adjusting to contact with the wider galaxy. Nothing in those records explained the toxicology test, or the gravity assessment, or the calm, steady way she moved through danger the rest of us barely tolerated in simulation. It was Petra again who pushed me to look deeper. "If the public files won't tell you anything," she said one evening, "maybe you should ask someone who actually reads the restricted ones." I did not have access to restricted files, obviously. Nobody at my rank did, but the Academy employed a small number of administrative assistants, junior staff members who helped process student records, and one of them, a quiet, easily flattered clerk named Aldrich Price, occasionally let information slip if you asked the right questions in the right tone. I found him during a slow shift in the records office, and after a few careful, casual questions about General Academy policy, I finally asked, as lightly as I could manage, whether human student files carried any unusual classifications. Aldrich hesitated, glancing around the empty office before lowering his voice. "There's a flag on her file," he said. "Not a common one. Most homeworld tags list basic environmental data, gravity, atmosphere, that kind of thing. Hers just says restricted, Sol class designation. I've only seen that tag a handful of times before, and never on a species this new to interstellar contact." I asked him what a Sol class designation actually meant. He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable now that he had already said more than he intended. "I don't know exactly. It's above my clearance too, but I know it's not a designation given lightly. Whatever it means, someone higher up decided her homeworld needed extra caution around the details." That single conversation changed the shape of my curiosity entirely. It was one thing to notice that Nora was unusually capable. It was another thing entirely to learn that the Academy itself, an institution that prided itself on transparency between member species, had quietly decided to hide information about where she came from. I did not tell Ivo any of this, though I noticed he had grown quieter around her since the gravity assessment, his usual jokes replaced by a wary, watchful silence whenever she was in the room. Whatever confidence he once had in his own superiority seemed to be cracking, slowly, uncomfortably, and I suspected he did not know what to do with that discomfort. Nora herself seemed unaware of, or simply indifferent to, the growing attention around her. She continued attending classes, continued eating alone in her quiet corner of the dining hall, continued taking notes by hand while the rest of us relied on neural slates. If she noticed the whispers, she never mentioned them. It was during a late evening study session, weeks into that unraveling mystery, that she finally let a small piece of the truth slip, not through any grand confession, but through something far smaller, and in hindsight, far more telling. We were working through a navigation problem together, one of the few times she had agreed to study with a small group rather than alone, and Petra, never one to hold back a question once curiosity took hold of her, asked casually what the weather was like on Earth. Nora paused for a long moment before answering, the way she often did when deciding how much to share. "It depends where you are," she said finally. "Some places are calm most of the year. Where I grew up, it wasn't like that." Petra, sensing an opening, pressed gently. "What was it like where you grew up?" Nora's fingers tightened slightly around her stylus, though her voice stayed even. "We had storms that could flatten a building if you weren't prepared for them," she said. "Winters cold enough to freeze a person solid within minutes if they weren't dressed properly. Summers hot enough that the ground itself could cause serious harm if you touched it without protection. And that's just the weather. That's before you even talk about everything else that lived there with us." "Everything else?" I asked, unable to stop myself. She looked up at me then, and for the first time since I had known her, there was something almost sad in her expression. Not fear, but a kind of tired familiarity, the look of someone who had explained this before to people who did not truly understand. "Predators," she said simply. "Big ones, small ones, some faster than anything you've probably trained against here. Diseases that could spread through an entire village before anyone understood what was happening. Earth isn't dangerous because of one single thing. It's dangerous because it's dangerous in 100 different ways, all at once, all the time, and you grow up learning to notice every single one of them, because the ones who don't notice usually don't get the chance to grow up at all." The study hall was very quiet after that. Petra's skin had gone pale, a color I now understood to mean unease rather than simple surprise. I found myself staring at Nora with a mixture of fascination and something closer to dread, realizing for the first time that everything I had witnessed so far, the calm reaction to alarms, the early detection of toxic air, the impossible endurance under crushing gravity, was not some strange anomaly. It was training, deeply ingrained, lifelong training, built into her from a world that apparently demanded it simply to survive childhood. I asked her, carefully, why the Academy's own records made Earth sound so unremarkable, so quiet, and safe. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Because most people here can't imagine what unremarkable actually costs where I come from," she said. "It's easier to write it down as ordinary than to explain the truth to people who've never had to fight for a single day of their lives just to see the next one." I did not sleep well that night. I kept replaying her words, kept picturing a world where danger was not an occasional lesson taught in a simulation dome, but a constant, unavoidable companion woven into every part of daily life. I began to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that we had been measuring her against the wrong standard entirely. We had judged her by how she compared to the rest of us, the sheltered, comfortable children of established interstellar societies, when in truth she should have been measured by an entirely different scale, one built for survival rather than comfort, one where the very traits that made her seem quiet and unassuming were actually evidence of careful, deliberate restraint. It would take one more incident, far more serious than any test or simulation, before the rest of the Academy finally understood what I had already begun to suspect. None of us were prepared for what happened next, least of all the people who had spent weeks quietly mocking the girl they assumed was simply the weakest student in the room. The mandatory survival exercise had been on our schedules for a full month before it happened, listed under a bland administrative title that gave no hint of what it would eventually become. Every second-year student was required to complete it, a supervised simulation inside the Academy's largest environmental dome, designed to expose us briefly to conditions harsher than anything we would normally encounter in daily life. The official purpose, according to Professor Hale, was humility. Most students at the Academy came from comfortable, advanced worlds, and the instructors believed it was important for us to understand, even briefly, what true environmental hardship felt like. The dome that day had been configured to simulate a rocky, wind-scoured landscape, thin atmosphere, jagged cliffs, artificial predators, programmed to test our reflexes without causing real harm. We were told the exercise would last 2 hours, monitored closely by staff, with safety overrides in place, to end the simulation instantly if anything went wrong. I remember standing at the entrance with the rest of my year, 60 of us grouped into small teams, waiting for the doors to open. Nora stood near the back of our group, quiet as always, though I noticed her eyes moving across the dome's distant terrain with a focus the rest of us did not share. While others chatted nervously or complained about the assignment, she studied the environment like she was reading a language only she understood. Evo, predictably, made one final comment before the doors opened, something about hoping the paper girl would not blow away in the artificial wind. A few students laughed, though the laughter felt thinner than it once had. The doors opened, and we stepped into the simulated wilderness. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as expected. Our team, which included myself, Petra, Evo, and 2 other students from smaller delegations, navigated the rocky terrain following the basic survival protocols we had studied for weeks. We identified safe paths across unstable ground, avoided the slow-moving mechanical predators programmed to test our awareness, and generally treated the entire exercise as a challenging but ultimately controlled experience. Nora moved through the terrain differently than the rest of us. Where we hesitated at each obstacle, checking our training manuals or debating our next move, she simply moved, choosing paths that seemed instinctive rather than calculated, avoiding hazards before the rest of us even recognized them as hazards at all. I asked her once, quietly, how she always seemed to know which way to go. "You start noticing patterns," she said. "Which ground looks too smooth to be stable? Which shadows move wrong for the light? It's not magic. It's just paying attention to things most people learn to ignore." Everything changed roughly 90 minutes into the exercise, when the dome's environmental systems, without warning, without any announcement from the instructors monitoring us remotely, began behaving in ways they were never meant to. The wind, which had been a steady, manageable simulation, suddenly intensified into something far stronger, strong enough to push several smaller students off balance entirely. The temperature dropped rapidly, a change our uniforms were not designed to handle for extended periods. Overhead, the artificial sky, meant to simulate a distant, hazy sun, flickered and dimmed unnaturally, plunging the dome into a strange, disorienting twilight. For a moment, we assumed it was part of the exercise, an added challenge designed to test our adaptability. That assumption lasted only until the safety alerts, meant to be silent unless triggered by genuine malfunction, began sounding across the dome's speaker system, a harsh, unmistakable warning tone that every student had been trained to recognize immediately. "Containment failure," a mechanical voice announced. "Environmental controls unresponsive. All students proceed immediately to designated evacuation points." Panic, real panic, spread through our group almost instantly. Petra's skin flashed a rapid, frantic pattern of colors I had never seen before. The 2 smaller students from our team froze entirely, uncertain which direction the evacuation points even were, since the shifting light had obscured most of the dome's directional markers. Ivo, to his credit, tried to take charge, shouting instructions that nobody could quite follow in the chaos, his usual confidence cracking under the sudden, genuine danger. I felt my own thoughts scatter, training and theory dissolving into simple, animal fear as the wind grew stronger and the temperature continued to drop. Nora's voice cut through the noise, calm, clear, and impossible to ignore. "Stop moving," she said, and something in her tone made even Ivo obey instantly. "Running blind in this wind will get someone hurt. We move together, low to the ground, and we follow the ridgeline to the east. That's where the terrain briefed us the maintenance access was." I did not remember any such briefing, and judging by the confused faces around me, neither did anyone else. But there was no time to question her, not with the wind howling louder and the artificial ground beginning to shift beneath a nearby cliff face, loose rock tumbling down in a way that suggested the dome's structural simulations were becoming genuinely unstable rather than simply harsh. We followed her. She moved low, steady, checking the ground ahead of each step before committing her full weight, guiding the smaller students by the arm when the wind threatened to push them off balance entirely. Petra stumbled once, her lighter frame catching the worst of a sudden gust, and Nora caught her before she could fall, steadying her with a grip far stronger than her slender frame suggested it should be. I do not know how long we moved like that, fighting the wind, the cold, the disorienting shifts in light, but it felt like far longer than the minutes it likely actually was. My lungs burned in the thinning, poorly regulated air. My legs ached from fighting against gusts strong enough to genuinely threaten our balance. It was Nora who first spotted the danger none of us had noticed yet. "Down," she said sharply, pulling Petra and one of the smaller students flat against the rocky ground, just as a large section of overhead structure, part of the dome's internal support framework, groaned loudly and shifted, dislodged by whatever malfunction had gripped the entire system. A shower of debris rained down where we had been standing only seconds earlier. Ivo, who had been slightly behind the rest of us, was not fast enough. I turned in time to see a smaller piece of falling debris strike his shoulder, spinning him hard into the rocky ground. He cried out, a sound sharp with genuine pain rather than simulated discomfort, and for a moment, the boy who had spent weeks mocking the girl he now desperately needed help from lay stunned on the unstable ground, unable to immediately rise. Nora did not hesitate. She moved faster than I had ever seen her move, crossing the unstable terrain in seconds, reaching Ivo just as another section of debris began to shift overhead. She grabbed him, pulling with a strength that seemed to defy her slender frame entirely, dragging him clear of the falling structure, moments before it collapsed exactly where he had been lying. The impact of the debris striking the ground sent a shockwave through the terrain that knocked the rest of us off our feet entirely. When I managed to look up again, coughing through the dust the impact had thrown into the already thin air, I saw Nora kneeling beside Ivo, quickly checking his injured shoulder with hands that moved with clear, practiced familiarity. "It's dislocated, not broken," she said, more to herself than to any of us. "We need to keep moving. Staying here is more dangerous than a little more pain right now." Ivo, pale and clearly in shock, simply nodded, too stunned by everything happening around him to offer any resistance. What followed felt less like a training exercise and more like the survival scenarios described in emergency manuals nobody expected to actually need. Nora guided our small, terrified group across the increasingly unstable terrain, correctly predicting where the ground would next give way, where the wind would strike hardest, where fallen structure created dangerous, unstable overhangs we needed to avoid entirely. She kept us moving as a unit, never leaving anyone behind, never allowing panic to scatter us into smaller, more vulnerable groups. When one of the smaller students began to fall behind, exhausted and disoriented by the cold, Nora simply adjusted our pace without complaint, keeping her voice calm and steady, even as the situation around us grew more chaotic by the minute. I asked her, gasping through the thin air, how she knew what to do, how she remained so calm while the rest of us could barely think straight. "Panic gets people hurt," she said simply. "Where I'm from, you learn early that the moment you stop thinking clearly is usually the moment things go wrong, so you train your mind to stay steady, no matter what your body is feeling. It's not that I'm not afraid, I just learned a long time ago that fear doesn't help unless you use it to move faster, not to freeze." We eventually reached the maintenance access point she had somehow correctly predicted, a reinforced door built into the dome's outer structure, designed for emergency use, exactly like the situation we now found ourselves in. It took several attempts to override the door's controls, the dome's malfunctioning systems making even basic mechanisms unreliable, but Nora worked through the problem with the same steady focus she had shown throughout the entire ordeal, eventually forcing the door open just as station security teams, alerted by the same emergency signals that had first warned us, arrived to begin a full evacuation of the dome. The rest of our year group, we later learned, had experienced similarly chaotic evacuations, though not every team had fared as well as ours. Several students required medical attention for minor injuries. One team, without anyone as calm or capable as Nora guiding them, became separated entirely and had to be located and rescued by security personnel nearly 20 minutes after the malfunction began, a delay that could have proven far more serious had the dome's failure escalated any further before containment teams regained control of its systems. When we finally emerged into the station's main corridor, breathing air that did not sting with cold or confusion, the full weight of what had happened finally settled over me. My hands would not stop shaking. Petra sat down heavily against the corridor wall, her skin cycling slowly through colors I now recognized as exhaustion and shock in equal measure. Ivo, supported carefully by 2 medical staff who had rushed to the scene, turned back toward Nora before they led him away for treatment. "You saved me," he said, his voice hoarse, stripped of all the arrogance it usually carried. "After everything I said to you, you still saved me." Nora looked at him for a long moment, and when she finally answered, there was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, only a quiet, tired honesty that struck me more deeply than any argument could have. "It was never about you," she said. "Where I'm from, you don't get to choose who deserves help and who doesn't. You just help, because tomorrow it might be you needing someone to do the same." Ivo had no response to that. He simply nodded, wincing slightly as the medical staff guided him toward the station's treatment center, leaving the rest of us standing in stunned silence in the aftermath of an exercise that had gone catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. It would take the Academy's investigators nearly a full day to determine the cause of the dome's malfunction, a rare but not impossible failure in the environmental regulation system, unrelated to any deliberate sabotage. But by the time that explanation was officially released, it barely mattered to those of us who had lived through it. We had seen, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what Nora Ellison was capable of when real danger, not simulated, not theoretical, finally arrived. And for the first time since she had joined our year, nobody in that corridor was laughing, or whispering, or mocking the quiet girl from the small blue planet at the edge of known space. They were simply staring at her, the way you stare at something you suddenly, completely understand you had never truly seen clearly before. The Academy could not ignore what had happened in the dome, not with dozens of witnesses and an official incident report that required a full accounting of every student's actions during the malfunction. Within days, an official inquiry was opened, and as part of that inquiry, for reasons never fully explained to the student body, the restricted portions of Nora's file were finally unsealed, at least partially, to a small review panel that included Professor Hale. I was not present for that review, of course, but Professor Hale, in a rare moment of openness during a follow-up lecture, shared enough of the unclassified summary to finally answer the questions that had followed Nora since her very first day at the Academy. Earth, the summary explained, had been classified under a rare designation reserved for what the wider galaxy called Deathworlds, planets where environmental conditions were so consistently hostile that the mere act of surviving to adulthood required a level of physical and mental adaptation far exceeding what most interstellar species ever needed to develop. The designation was rare enough that only a handful of known worlds carried it, and rarer still that any Deathworld species had achieved interstellar contact at all, since the same brutal conditions that shaped their resilience typically slowed technological progress considerably. Earth, apparently, was one of the few exceptions, a planet whose people had somehow managed to claw their way into space, despite, or perhaps because of, everything working against them. Professor Hale explained, carefully choosing her words, that human physiology carried adaptations most other species simply did not require. Denser bone structure than their size suggested. Immune systems capable of responding to an extraordinary range of biological threats. Sensory awareness tuned toward detecting danger long before it became obvious to less experienced observers. None of these traits made humans stronger or faster than many other species in any single category, but combined, they created something the Academy's own classification system had struggled to properly categorize, a species whose ordinary baseline looked, to the rest of the galaxy, remarkably like specialized training. It explained the toxicology test. It explained the gravity assessment. It explained, most vividly of all, the calm, practiced way Nora had guided us through genuine danger, while the rest of us struggled simply to think clearly. I found her later that evening in the same quiet corner of the dining hall she had claimed since her very first day, sitting alone as always, though I noticed several other students glancing her way with an expression that had shifted, unmistakably, from mockery to something closer to careful respect. I asked if I could sit with her, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not seem surprised by the request. "I heard they finally told you something," she said, without looking up from her meal. "Not everything," I admitted, "just enough to understand why none of this ever should have surprised us as much as it did." She was quiet for a long moment, turning her utensils slowly in her hands, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weariness I had not heard from her before. Not fear, not sadness exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent a long time being misunderstood and had simply learned to live with it. "Do you want to know what it was actually like?" she asked, "or do you just want the version that fits neatly into an official file?" I told her I wanted to know the truth, whatever that meant. She nodded slowly, and then, for the first time, she told me about home. She grew up, she explained, in a small settlement near a coastline prone to violent seasonal storms, the kind capable of leveling buildings and reshaping entire stretches of shoreline within a matter of hours. Her earliest memory, she said, was not a birthday or a family gathering, but the sound of her parents securing storm shutters while the sky outside turned a color she had never seen described accurately in any off-world language. By the time she was old enough to understand danger as a concept, she already understood it as a daily reality. She described learning to recognize the specific scent of an approaching storm long before instruments could confirm it. She described drills, not unlike the Academy's own emergency exercises, except conducted not as occasional lessons, but as regular essential practice, because a single mistake during an actual event could mean the difference between her family's survival and a tragedy the rest of her community would quietly mourn. She spoke of wildlife that most off-world biology textbooks would classify as extraordinarily dangerous, predators capable of tracking prey across vast distances, creatures whose venom or strength could end a careless life within moments. She described these threats not with drama, but with the same flat, practical tone she might use to describe difficult weather, simply another fact of the world she had been born into. It was not all danger, she added quickly, noticing perhaps the growing weight in my expression. There was beauty too, real beauty, mornings after a storm when the air smelled clean and the whole coastline seemed to shine. People who loved fiercely because they understood exactly how quickly things could be taken away. Communities that looked out for each other, because surviving alone was so much harder than surviving together. But yes, she admitted, it was also constantly, unavoidably dangerous, in ways that most species out here simply never had to consider as part of ordinary childhood. I asked her, carefully, why she had chosen to hold so much of herself back since arriving at the Academy, why she had allowed the rest of us to underestimate her so completely for so long. Her answer surprised me more than anything she had shared so far. Because the first time I didn't hold back, she said quietly, people were afraid of me. She explained, slowly, that during her early evaluations before being accepted into the exchange program, she had performed at her natural, uninhibited capability, and the reaction from evaluators, though professionally restrained, had carried an unmistakable undercurrent of unease. It was not admiration she had seen in their expressions. It was caution, the particular wariness reserved for something that did not fit comfortably into an established understanding of the world. I learned quickly, she said, that it's easier for people to accept you if you make yourself smaller first. If I hold back, if I let people assume I'm just an ordinary student figuring things out, they're curious instead of afraid. But if I show everything I'm actually capable of right away, that curiosity turns into something else, something colder. I did not know what to say to that, not immediately. I thought about Ivo, about the weeks of mockery she had endured without complaint. Weeks she could have ended in a single demonstration of her genuine capability, and instead she had chosen to absorb the insults quietly, rather than risk the discomfort her full potential seemed to provoke in others. "That's not fair to you," I finally said. She smiled, faintly, without much humor behind it. "Maybe not, but it's safer, for me and for everyone else. Where I'm from, you learn that being the strongest person in the room isn't always something to be proud of. Sometimes it's something you have to be careful with, because strength without control just becomes another kind of danger." We sat together in silence for a while after that, and I found myself looking at her differently than I had at any point since her arrival. Where I had once seen a quiet, unremarkable student struggling to keep pace with the rest of us, I now saw someone who had been carrying an enormous weight since childhood, carefully, deliberately, choosing restraint not out of weakness, but out of a hard-earned understanding of exactly how much damage unrestrained strength could cause if left unchecked. The Academy, in the days that followed, began treating her differently as well. Instructors who had once corrected her gently now consulted her directly during survival and environmental lessons, recognizing expertise none of them could match. Students who had once avoided her now sought her out, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a growing, genuine respect for someone who had quietly proven herself capable of extraordinary things without ever seeking credit for them. Ivo, recovering steadily from his injury, approached her formally within the week, offering an apology that felt, for the first time since I had known him, entirely without pretense. "I misjudged you completely," he said, standing a little stiffly, his usual confidence tempered by something closer to humility. "I assumed weakness because I didn't understand what strength actually looks like when it chooses restraint." Nora accepted his apology simply, without any need to extract further discomfort from him. "Most people misjudge what they don't understand," she said. "It doesn't make it right, but it does make it common. What matters is what you do once you understand better." It would have been easy, at that point, for the story to end quietly, a lesson learned, assumptions corrected, a fragile peace settling over the Academy as everyone adjusted to a new, more accurate understanding of the quiet human girl in their midst. But the galaxy, as I would soon learn, rarely allows such simple resolutions to stand undisturbed for long. Something far larger than a training exercise gone wrong was already approaching the station, something that would demand far more from Nora Ellison than any classroom lesson or survival simulation ever could, and it would arrive far sooner than any of us were prepared for. The warning came just after midnight station time, though nothing about it felt gentle enough to be called a warning at all. I woke to the sound of the station's true alarm, not a drill, not a scheduled test, but the deep, layered tone reserved exclusively for genuine emergencies, a sound every student learned to fear from their very first orientation lecture. My door slid open automatically, emergency lighting flooding the corridor in a harsh, urgent red, and students poured out of their rooms in various states of confusion and half-dressed panic. An unidentified vessel had entered the station's outer perimeter without authorization, ignoring every hailing attempt from station security. By the time officials fully understood what they were dealing with, the vessel had already launched a boarding craft toward one of the station's secondary docking rings, the one closest to our academic wing. I learned later, through fragments of information passed frantically between staff and older students, that the vessel belonged to a group of independent raiders operating far outside any recognized system's jurisdiction, the kind of opportunists who preyed on isolated stations and vulnerable transports, gathering resources, technology, and occasionally, when the opportunity presented itself, hostages valuable enough to ransom or sell. What made that night different from any ordinary raid? What turned a frightening but survivable emergency into something far more dangerous? Was the specific reason this particular group had targeted our station at all. They had heard the reports. Rumors traveled quickly across interstellar networks, especially rumors involving something as rare and valuable as a Deathworld species demonstrating extraordinary capability during a containment failure. Somewhere along the chain of information leaking out from the Academy's own investigation, word had reached exactly the kind of people who saw such a rumor not as a curiosity, but as an opportunity. They wanted her. I did not learn this immediately. In the chaos of that first hour, most of us knew only that armed intruders had breached a section of the station, that security forces were mobilizing to contain the threat, and that every student was ordered to remain in designated shelter zones until further notice. I found myself herded, along with Petra and dozens of other frightened students, into one of the station's reinforced common areas. Doors sealed, lights dimmed, everyone waiting in tense, uncertain silence for information that came far too slowly. It was Professor Hale, arriving breathless and visibly shaken, who finally delivered the news that turned my blood cold. "They're asking for the human student," she said, addressing the room with a controlled calm I could tell was costing her considerable effort to maintain. "The one from the containment incident. They know her name. They're demanding she be handed over, or they'll begin damaging station infrastructure until she is." The room erupted into frightened murmuring, and I felt my stomach twist as I realized, with sudden horrible clarity, that Nora was not among the students sheltered in that room. I scanned the crowd twice, certain I had simply missed her, before Petra grabbed my arm, her skin flashing a rapid, distressed pattern I had never seen before. "She wasn't in her room when the alarm went off," Petra whispered. "I checked before we were moved here. Her door was already open." I did not need anyone to explain what that meant. Nora had heard the same alarm the rest of us had, understood immediately what kind of danger it represented, and rather than wait in a shelter for instructions, she had already moved toward whatever was happening. I do not fully know what compelled me to leave that shelter room, against every safety protocol drilled into us since our first day at the academy. Perhaps it was simple loyalty towards someone who had saved a friend of mine during the containment failure. Perhaps it was something less noble, an unwillingness to sit safely behind sealed doors while someone else faced danger, meant, in some twisted way, entirely because of what she had shown us all. Whatever the reason, I slipped away from the shelter during a moment of confusion, ignoring Petra's whispered protest, and made my way toward the docking ring where the intruders had first breached the station. I found Nora exactly where instinct told me she would be, in a maintenance corridor overlooking the breached docking bay, watching the situation unfold with the same steady, focused calm she had shown during the containment failure weeks earlier. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly, without turning to look at me, as though she had sensed my approach long before I announced myself. "Neither should you," I answered, my voice shaking slightly despite my best effort to sound composed. "They're asking for you specifically." "I know," she said simply. Below us, through a reinforced viewing panel, I could see the intruders more clearly now. 6 of them, heavily armored, moving with the confident, practiced efficiency of people accustomed to violence, as a professional tool rather than a last resort. They had already subdued 2 station security officers, their weapons trained steadily on a small group of maintenance staff who had been unfortunate enough to be working near the breach when it occurred. Their leader, a broad-shouldered figure with augmented plating visible along his exposed forearms, spoke into a handheld communicator loud enough for the corridor's audio pickups to carry his words clearly. "We know you're listening," he said, his tone carrying the casual cruelty of someone entirely confident in his advantage. "Hand over the Deathworld girl, and everyone else walks away untouched. Refuse, and we start making examples, starting with the staff currently kneeling in front of us." I felt Nora go very still beside me, though her expression remained carefully unreadable. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied the scene below with the same intense, practical focus she brought to every dangerous situation I had watched her navigate since her arrival, cataloging exits, weapons, positioning, the subtle physical tells of 6 armed individuals who had clearly underestimated exactly what kind of target they had chosen to pursue. "I'm going to give them what they asked for," she finally said, and before I could protest, she was already moving toward the nearest access point leading down into the docking bay. I grabbed her arm, panic overtaking whatever caution had kept me quiet until that moment. "You can't just walk down there. They'll kill you. Or worse." She looked at me then, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something in her expression I had never witnessed before. Not fear, not resignation, but a quiet, focused readiness, the calm of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for a moment, exactly like this one, even if she had hoped she would never actually need it. "They think a Deathworld girl is a prize to be captured," she said. "They have no idea what that phrase actually means. Stay here, Callan. Whatever happens next, stay here." I did not stay. I followed her at a distance, staying low, hidden within the maintenance corridor's shadowed edges, watching as she stepped into the open docking bay, in full view of the armed raiders below. The leader turned toward her immediately, his posture shifting into something almost amused as he took in her small, unassuming frame. "This is her," one of his companions said, sounding faintly disappointed. "Doesn't look like much." Nora said nothing, simply walked forward with slow, measured steps, her hands visible and open at her sides, the picture of calm surrender. It was, I would later understand, exactly the image she wanted them to see. The leader gestured for two of his armored companions to secure her, and it was in that exact moment, the moment their guard shifted from wary readiness to careless confidence, that everything changed. I have tried many times since that night to properly describe what happened next, and I have never quite managed to capture it fully in words. It happened too quickly, too efficiently, the kind of controlled violence that seemed less like combat and more like the natural, inevitable conclusion of everything Nora had spent her entire life training her body and mind to accomplish. The two raiders who approached to restrain her never managed to lay a hand on her at all. She moved between them in a single fluid motion, using their own momentum and confidence against them, disabling both before their companions fully registered what was happening. The remaining raiders, trained professionals despite their casual cruelty, reacted quickly, weapons raising, but Nora was already moving again, closing distance faster than their targeting systems could properly adjust, each movement precise, economical, utterly devoid of hesitation or wasted effort. I understood, watching from the shadows, that I was witnessing something the rest of the galaxy had genuinely never fully appreciated. This was not brute strength alone, not simple physical superiority. This was a mind and body shaped entirely by a lifetime spent anticipating danger, reading intention before action, understanding exactly how to end a threat with minimal, controlled force, rather than reckless aggression. Within moments that felt both impossibly brief and strangely stretched, all 6 raiders lay disabled across the docking bay floor, none of them permanently harmed, but every one of them entirely, completely subdued. The leader, the last still conscious, stared up at her from the ground with an expression I recognized immediately, the same wide-eyed disbelief I had once worn myself during those first confusing weeks of watching her quietly defy every assumption made about her. "What are you?" he managed to ask, his voice stripped of all its earlier confidence. Nora knelt beside him, her voice calm, almost gentle, though there was an edge beneath it that made even I, standing safely hidden nearby, feel a chill along my spine. "Someone you should have left alone," she said simply. Station security arrived moments later, securing the subdued raiders and beginning the careful process of confirming that no lasting harm had come to the station staff, who had been held at their mercy only minutes earlier. Nora stood quietly to the side throughout the process, answering questions calmly, offering no embellishment, no pride, simply a clear, factual account of what had happened. I approached her once the chaos had finally settled, my hands still trembling slightly from everything I had witnessed. "You could have died," I said. "Or worse, why didn't you wait for security to handle it properly?" She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because every second we waited was another second those staff members spent kneeling in front of armed strangers, wondering if it would be their last moment alive. Where I'm from, you don't wait for someone else to fix a dangerous situation if you're capable of fixing it yourself. Waiting costs lives. I wasn't going to let that happen if I could prevent it." In the days that followed, the Academy's response to the incident shifted the entire student body's understanding of Nora Ellison permanently. She was not simply the quiet, unassuming exchange student who had once been mocked and underestimated. She was something the galaxy's established powers had clearly never fully appreciated, a living demonstration of exactly what conditions like Earth's could shape in a person forced to survive them from birth. Evo, who had grown into something closer to a genuine friend in the weeks since his apology, found me shortly after the incident's official resolution, his expression thoughtful in a way I had never seen from him before. "I used to think strength was something you displayed," he said. "Loud, obvious, impossible to ignore. I understand now that real strength is often something entirely different, something quiet, until the exact moment it absolutely needs to be otherwise." I found Nora later that evening in the recreational dome, where the environmental simulation had once again been set to the gentle electrical storm that had first revealed a small piece of her true nature weeks earlier. She stood in the artificial rain exactly as she had that first time, face turned upward, eyes closed, the faint rumble of distant, simulated thunder rolling softly overhead. I sat down beside her without a word, watching the gentle flashes of light dance across the dome's curved ceiling. "Does it still remind you of home?" I finally asked. She smiled, faintly, genuinely, in a way that felt entirely different from the careful, restrained expressions she had worn during her first weeks at the academy. "Every time," she said. "But it's different now, being here. Back home, storms meant danger, meant needing to be ready for whatever came next. Here, it's just rain, just noise, nothing waiting behind it. Does that scare you?" I asked, genuinely curious, having nothing to prepare for anymore. She considered the question carefully, the way she considered everything, before finally shaking her head. "No," she said. "It just means I finally get to decide what kind of strength I want to be, instead of only the kind I was forced to become." The thunder rolled softly overhead once more, gentle, harmless, nothing at all like the storms she had once described from the small, dangerous, beautiful world she called home. And for the first time since I had known her, she did not flinch, or brace, or watch the exits with careful, practiced awareness. She simply stood there, calm, unguarded, entirely herself, finally allowed to be exactly as strong and exactly as gentle as she had always truly been underneath everything the galaxy had once refused to understand about the quiet girl they thought was just a student. They had been wrong about her from the very first day. They would never make that mistake again.